Our long-term goal is not socialism. Our long-term goal is the Socialist Party. In other words, can we envision socialism? No. Can we envision a socialist party? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can start to envision what it would take to build such a party in terms of what people's organizing capacities have to be. And then we can evaluate what people's capacities are on the ground at a grassroots level in order to develop those capacities.
Welcome to the Cutrone Zone again. With me today, as always, is Chris Cutrone, your track coach, our resident genius, the last Marxist, Chris Cutrone. I'm Doug Lane, author of Wave of Mutilation. I'm going to pick that book. And the king. I am the king of Sublation Media. I decided recently. So, Chris, it looks like, I have not been paying as close attention as maybe I ought to, but it looks like we could be seeing the war in the Middle East blow up into a full-scale regional war. Israel has bombed Iran. Trump seemed to be put on his back foot. It gets a little overwhelming to keep up with all the dangers that are arising in this moment, and all the ways in which maybe some of the hopes that people had for peace to be achieved through this last election being dashed a bit. So I wanted to know what your thoughts are about the war with Iran that appears to have broken out.
I know that you and I are going to talk maybe in the second half about like the Donald Rumsfeld phenomenon of known unknowns and unknown knowns and this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And something that I raised in my Bonapartism article about conspiracy theories being the essence of the Bonapartist state, the capitalist state, we can say, just for shorthand. And that this is traceable back to the mid 19th century, and it's been an endemic phenomenon. But it's and it's more or less prominent when there's a crisis. And I think that for me, the big challenge has been how did this happen? So Israel has launched a war against Iran, and they promised to escalate. It has like limited aims, but then it has unlimited aims. So limited aims are to impair the nuclear program, to set it back some years, and to impair the ballistic missile capacities and set it back for some significant amount of time. And there was a lot of talk about this leading up to it. And Trump was very clear that he did not want it to happen, that it would screw with his negotiations that he had ongoing with Iran, and that he really wanted to bring to some fruitful conclusion. He wanted a peace deal with Iran. But instead now it looks like, that was some kind of tricking the Iranian regime into lowering its guard so that Israel could do the surprise attack, as if that was necessary, like as if it was necessary for Trump to mislead the Iranians in order to allow Israel to attack. No, right? So last year, Israel had already severely damaged Iranian defenses. So there was a question of a window of opportunity for an Israeli attack where that window might close. And it might close in two ways. It might close militarily. Iran might be able to rebuild its defenses, and it might close diplomatically if Trump makes a deal. So they had to act before either of those things came to pass. But of course, Trump has to act like he supports it, because after all, Iran is an enemy and Israel is an ally. So even if you didn't want it to happen, you still have to be on the side of your ally. Right? But the convoluted reasoning involved, and the paranoid thinking involved, and the conspiratorial ideas involved I have spoken recently privately with a leftist, someone that we're both acquainted with, who said that they thought that Israel has something over Trump, Epstein. So intelligent, reasonable people believe these things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the phenomenon we have to consider. But again, basic logic would dictate that no, Trump's not going to negotiate in bad faith.
Right.
And, you know, and it's clear that he had his differences with Netanyahu, but that Netanyahu has to say that they're on the same page and there's no daylight between them. Although, interestingly, Netanyahu did say that he has to make his decisions and Trump has to make his own decisions. Right? When he was asked point blank about did Israel get a green light from Trump, he said, well, no, we have to make our own decisions and Trump has to make his own decisions and we each have to act in the best interest of our countries.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And so but then people will say, well, of course they have to deny that Trump gave the green light. And I'm like, but why? Why do they have to deny that? In other words, Iran is an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
A declared enemy. You know,
Right.
Israel is the little Satan and the US is the great Satan. So they're declared enemies. And so, you know, now, interestingly, the diplomacy, it looked like the best that could be hoped for would be essentially to reestablish the JCPOA, the Obama deal that Trump had condemned.
Right.
In the same way that the USMCA is basically NAFTA. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are differences. However, right? And so we have to pay attention to what Trump actually says about these things. He says he has the same goals. He said, for instance, in an interview recently that, you know, he likes Biden, he likes Obama, he likes these people, but they were bad leaders who created disastrous outcomes for the United States. But he likes them, you know, and he's like, but that has nothing to do with it.
Right.
Right? I think their policies were bad. But then when you get down to it, how are the policies bad? Because the goals are the same. He just thinks the execution was bad.
Yeah.
Right? So it's tactical, not strategic. It's means, not ends.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's hard for people to understand. They don't understand that, of course, the goals, the ends are the same for the Democrats and the Republicans, and you know, and the realists and the neocons and this and that. I mean, obviously, the people who are like these like very policy-oriented people, and then they're kind of fanboys or whatever, and fangirls who like pay very close attention, you know, to the spectator sport of it all. They're very committed to, no, you kick the ball this way, not that way, when you're trying to score a goal from so many yards away, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the goal's the same. You get the fucking ball in the net, you know, like a soccer reference. Anyway, so, you know, but people are very passionate about their favorite player should have done this and not that on the field. And we have to step back and say, no, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something else. We're talking about socialism. We're talking about entirely different goals.
Right. Yeah, this is
and playing a different game. Not even not playing the same game, not having the same goals.
This morning I went on Facebook. I rarely go on Facebook, but I went on Facebook and I saw someone had posted a meme, and it was an anti-Trump meme, and it was cutting $800 billion from Medicaid, $100 billion from food stamps, spending $42 million on a military parade on his birthday, and giving him $1 trillion away in tax cuts to the richest 1%. Trump is, you know, basically the final line is, you know, Trump is screwing you over, something like that. And I responded by saying, okay, the idea, just on the face of it, the idea is to redirect money that's being spent on consumption, which leads nowhere, to getting that money to be spent on production. Most people would prefer not to be on food stamps or on Medicaid, but rather earn a good living and be able to pay for themselves. And maybe none of this will work, right? It's likely it won't work. Certainly it can't work in the long term. We know it can't work in the long term. But let's be clear what the actual aim is here.
Well, especially because we're dealing with like blow by blow analysis,
right.
The 24-hour news cycle.
But this idea that what Trump is trying to do is hurt the poor, give trillions of dollars to his friends, and throw himself a big parade. And the other thing I said is, you throw a big military parade to convince your enemies that you're to be taken seriously and that you're a powerful nation. And it's pretty crude, but all of this fits together.
I mean, look, we are subject to a constant barrage of anti-Trump propaganda nonstop. It's North Korea style.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's ill-intentioned. Everything is from the basest of motives. Everything is bad at the level of execution. Just everything. He's incompetent. He's senile. He's evilly motivated. Everything, right? Just nonstop, constant, right?
Right.
So, look, if Kamala had been elected or Biden had been elected, there's a very good chance that the 250th anniversary of the founding of the Continental Army would have been celebrated as part of the beginning of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution next year.
Right.
And the parade would have looked exactly the same. But instead of hearing, oh, it's like pathetic, it shows weakness, it's like amateur hour, people would see it for what it was, which was a very humane parade, meaning it wasn't a fascist, totalitarian, perfectly synchronized, like it wasn't like a North Korea or China style parade. And it was on the founding day of the Continental Army. It is on U.S. Army Day, and that does happen to be Trump's birthday. But no, it was not about Trump's birthday, because originally he wanted to do a parade in his first term on Veterans Day. So what would that have to do with his birthday? It's just stupid. Everything is just stupid. Like, in other words, we are really being subject to rank stupidity constantly about Trump. Like, there's no common sense to it.
Right.
And so, what
and I felt edgy pointing out what I pointed out, right? Like, I felt like I was really going out on a limb saying, oh, maybe this is trickle down economics and, positioning yourself in the world and, not.
I think that what he wanted to show the world was the U.S. has pride in its military, but its military is not an aggressive force.
Right.
In other words, obviously they want to do things that will boost recruitment. They want to humanize the army. I mean, these are all problematic things.
Oh, of course.
Right. In other words, like, obviously the U.S. military is like a deadly force of death and destruction that has killed millions of people in recent history.
Yeah, right.
Which Trump says. He says war on terror cost millions. It cost millions of lives and trillions of dollars, and it accomplished nothing.
Right. Okay.
So, given that fact, he says this many times, over and over and over, on the campaign trail, every speech. This is what the Democrats, the audience, is unaware of. They're unaware of the bubble on the other side.
Right.
There's another media ecosphere, and if you're not aware of that, you have no idea what Trump is about.
Right.
You have no idea. I've watched, I would say, pretty much every Trump speech since 2015. I have subjected myself to this. Because, of course, I'm curious. How consistent is it? It's very consistent. He's very consistent. On the other hand, he's an amateur. But also, that's his claim. His claim is that you don't need to be a foreign policy expert because the foreign policy experts haven't succeeded. And so maybe we need a fresh start, and maybe I'll get this like real estate hotel guy to do the negotiation, Steve Woodcock.
Right.
Rather than someone whose head is up their ass on American foreign policy doxa.
This is like as American as apple pie in a way.
Yes, it's Citizen Trump. This is civilian government. Like my husband Fazell said, well, you know, like Pete Hegseth is incompetent.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, yeah, he might be, but that's the point. Like, how competent do you want this guy to be? Oh, you want Lloyd Austin, who was like a general on the Joint Chiefs of Staff? No, you need a civilian Department of
Right.
Defense, Secretary of Defense head. You don't. And they had to get special dispensation to appoint a general for that position. Rightly so, because there's a conflict of interest there. In other words, you want civilian oversight over the military, which is a bureaucracy. That's all that it is. It's a bureaucracy, and it has its self-interest, and it has its corruption, and it is a means that becomes an end in itself. Meaning, what does the U.S. military want to do? Does it want to win wars? No, it wants to keep itself going.
Right. But
and if it wins wars along the way, that's fine, but it's secondary.
With Iran,
Yeah.
Right? It strikes me that, yeah, you want a civilian government, you want citizen somebody, and maybe
Tulsi
not
Gabbard.
Trump. Yeah, Tulsi Gabbard. You want people who are working in the interests of society to the degree that that's possible. But
and in the terms that they understand it.
Right.
Which is, of
but
course,
it also seems like there's an apparatus at work that it doesn't really matter who the hell is in the office, because
that's a problem.
Yeah.
Right. In other words, it's a real problem. So, like, this attack.
I think this attack on Iran would have happened if Kamala got.
It would have.
Or Biden got elected.
Definitely, it would have. Right. Yeah. I mean, it's like the Ukraine attack on the Russian strategic bombers throughout Russia. Was done by people like in Russia, and Israel opened their attack very similarly with drone attacks launched from within Iran. Obviously, these things were planned under Biden.
Yeah.
They were planned way ahead of time under Biden. And so it's very much Bay of Pigs, meaning how much did the Trump administration know? How much was planned ahead of time under the previous administration? How much did they actually clue them in the transition or not? Probably not, because they would be afraid the Trump administration would stop it. So, and so that's what we're dealing with. But of course, the U.S. can't show weakness. There can't be any daylight between Israel and the U.S., an ally, let alone daylight between Trump and the military.
Oh, right.
Right? And I think that what's remarkable about, like, Pete Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard is that they're millennial veterans, meaning they're veterans of the war on terror. And the fact that Trump is the anti-war on terror guy who put veterans of the war on terror who know from personal experience what went wrong. And Tulsi's more unambiguously anti-war. Pete Hegseth is more like a veterans advocate and, like, notoriously an advocate for people accused of war crimes. But basically the idea is, let's cut our losses. And that includes, like, do you really want to prosecute people for war crimes in a war that was a fiasco?
Right.
Right. In other words, there is a consistency here. And it's not like pacifism versus warmongering or something like that. And it's also not neocon versus realism. It's not some geopolitical strategy other than the U.S. is the top dog. It is. And so it's just about the terms of Pax Americana. And even the U.S.'s enemies depend on the U.S. geopolitically. Meaning they depend on the status quo being maintained.
Right.
It's a balance of power situation, and it's regional as well as global. So this whole idea that it's like the Eurasian Duganite collective, it's Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, against, like, the seafaring peoples, the British and the Americans and whatever, the Japanese or whatever, and the Australians. No. Right? Not at all, because they ultimately have different interests. And ultimately, Iran is a regional power, and a regional power that straddles the Middle East and South Asia.
I love this quaint notion that people's national character has to do with whether or not they're seafaring or landlocked.
Continental. Yeah.
Yeah. like, wouldn't that be nice?
It's just stupid. Look, obviously, people want like narratives. They want like explanations, even with the lamest, like threadbare conceptualizations. But they want like a story they can tell themselves that makes sense, that explains why things happen, or even why they don't happen. You know, and it's like, it really, you got to be skeptical of this approach. This way of understanding things is very dubious, and I would say it's inherently conservative. Not just conservative reactionary. It's right wing.
Yeah.
Meaning geopolitics per se is right wing.
Oh yeah.
And from a socialist perspective. And that's why we should take seriously the neoliberal resistance to a overly geopolitical framework.
Right.
So this morning I watched a Iran International TV news outlet. They broadcast on the internet. They're watched in Iran. They're the independent, banned, suppressed outlet that's watched the most in Iran. And they're based in the UK and the US, whatever. And they were interviewing Yahoo. And then Yahoo was like, we want to make Iran great again. And it's all Cyrus the Great, liberated the Jews. And so we're going to liberate Iran from theocratic thuggery. Yeah, like just total insanity, right? At one level, like schlock, On the other hand, it's also true. He's like, we should have free commerce and travel between Iran and Israel. The only reason we don't is because of this Islamic Republic theocratic thuggery. True. True. But no, it's the Palestinians, it's this. No. Children. No. Right? And so, I'm obviously not a fan of Netanyahu. I do think that he is a bad actor in a number of respects. I'm against the demonization of Israel. I'm against the demonization of the neocons. I think these things should be seen realistically. Like, there are policies, there are strategies, and they line up more or less with civilian interests. And then there's also the question of how people talk themselves into policies. In other words, did Israel really believe that Iran was on the brink of developing nuclear weapons in a way that it hadn't been for the last 10 or 20 years? Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Meaning maybe they're lying, maybe they believe their own lies. And that's the world that we're living in. Like, it's a scary world that way. Meaning, of course, it's much more disturbing for us to encounter the possibility that the people in charge might believe their own lies.
Right.
But that is a lot of it. That is, they talk themselves into things. They do believe their own lies. That's the scary part.
Yeah. I've brought this book up many times. It's very kind of basic bitch move to bring it up, but over on America This Week with Taibbi and Kern, they just finished reading 1984. And in 1984, there's something called doublethink.
Yeah.
Right? Where you have to know the truth, but you also have to believe the lie. And I think that's most of the time what goes on. And that doublethink is not merely lying, but it really is actually knowing one thing and believing something else. I think in acting is the thing that is not true is true on the level of belief and action. I think that's what we're dealing with. And I don't think here's the scary thing. This is a scarier thing than the politicians believe their own bullshit. So do we.
Oh, well, that's just different, though. Like, in other words, then we could just call it delusional. Meaning, like, people who believe things without any skin in the game whatsoever, right?
But do we have no skin in the game? I mean, we do and we don't, right?
We don't. Doug, it's different. Come on.
Okay.
It's different. Meaning like the leadership of the Islamic Republic obviously has skin in the game.
Right.
The leadership of Iran has skin in the game. And again, it's simplified. It's turned into, Netanyahu's trying to stay in power in order to avoid going to jail. I don't think that's really the case, and that's driving policy.
Right.
I think that again, cause and effect are reversed. And I think that also with Trump, that he has skin in the game, meaning he doesn't want to be a feckless president. He doesn't be shown to be weak. He wants to be credible as a negotiator. He wants to be credible. He wants to be able to wield the big stick as a credible threat, but as a particular kind of threat. Meaning, reluctant to go to war, but capable if necessary.
Right.
And, and obviously there's a lot of look, what it boils down to is whether Trump is an idiot and how ignorant he is and whatever, it doesn't matter. He's president. That's scary, I guess, but it's also simply the case. And, so we have to deal with the reality rather than, meaning he will make his own decisions. And they've had all sorts of ways of analyzing this the last 10 years. It's like, he listens to the last person he talks to and all this stuff, like very simplistic psychologizing. And again, no, he's consistent. And so anyway, look, obviously, so here's another thing, right? So,
well, I was trying to segue into your writings with the
I've actually studied Iran, but I've also studied the deep history, meaning roughly 1979 to 1989. The history of the left in Iran.
Yeah, this is what I was getting at. Is like the doublethink on the left, the way in which even though we don't have skin in the game, but we convince ourselves of things that we know aren't true in order to.
So my understanding of these things is very particular. It's of a certain moment, and I did study this material as a college student, but I did a deep dive into a major research project on the Iranian Revolution under the supervision of Iqbal Ahmad at Hampshire College. And a lot of my perspective comes from Ervand Abrahamian, 2 books of his. One is The 2-Day Party, and the other is the Mujahideen al-Khalq, the MEK. The Iranian Mujahideen is the title of the book. And Iran Between Two Revolutions is the other book that's on the Communist Party in Iran, or the People's Party, but it's the Communist Party. And I was studying this in the time, right before Ayatollah Khomeini, the original leader of the Islamic Revolution, died. He made sure that all the leftists in prison were killed. So thousands of leftists were killed in 1989. It was a massive massacre in the prisons. And it was the 2-Day Party, it was the Fedayeen. They were the new left, like Che Guevara, or kind of quasi-Maoist, like guerrilla fighters. And when one encounters people in exile whose family were leftists, right, often you'll meet people who have some background with the Fedayeen. But then there's the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen were kind of left Islamists, or kind of Islamo-Marxists, and a little bit different from a kind of post-Marxist Islamist, and that's Ali Shariati. And, these figures and these parties, movements, tendencies, these ideological tendencies, but these parties, these forces, political forces, were my window into Iranian history. One of the things that I do, which puts me at odds with a lot of people, including people on the left, is I have a left-centric view of history. Meaning, I feel that if you want to understand the history of a place, look at the history of the left in that place.
Right.
And, which is counterintuitive, especially when the left is weak or failed or, doesn't seem to have been consequential.
Right.
right? But it's part of my Walter Benjamin ethic, reading history against the grain. Meaning I'm concerned with the wasted potential of history.
Mm-hmm.
And along the way, I also studied the history of the Iraqi Communist Party and its tragedy. And studied other things too, like the Egyptian Communist Party, Nasserism, etc. So relationship
Right.
between communism, Stalinism, really, in the Middle East or in the Arab or Muslim world, and nationalism, and then Islamism. And the Iranian Revolution as a peculiar case because it's Shia and it's Iran, it's Persian, it's not Arab, and it's Shia, not Sunni. It is peculiar, but that's the window through which I came to understand these things. And also, I have to say, understand things about politics and political parties more generally, like in ways that I think would apply elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That part of my understanding of like movements and party politics came from this study that Abrahamian did of the history of the two-day party.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's long history from before the Russian Revolution up until the Islamic Revolution. So the whole 20th century, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's also what the Frankfurt School called micrological history, which you take the particular case and you make it illuminate the entire totality. Meaning, what would it mean? Because obviously the Islamic Revolution in Iran, they're very Islamocentric and very Shia Islam-centric.
Mm-hmm.
So of course, and they are, also Persian civilizational in a particular way. So whether it's Iran or the Islamic Republic is always ambiguous. But okay, so from their perspective, of course, they're seeing all of history through their own position.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, go for that, right? Like in other words, okay, and that it does give them a particular paranoia, by the way, and it's a weirdly misplaced paranoia. Like they usually blame the British for things that are probably the Americans, right? But it's because of this history with Britain, and because they were in the midst of the great game between Russia and Britain in the 19th and into the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And then they also had certain affinities, like with Germany as like a counterpoint to the British and the Russians. And anyway, but again, I think in my Ozark article, I called it paranoid criticism, right? Which is overemphasizing the significance of something because it does actually illuminate things. So, on the one hand, I feel like I'm very knowledgeable. On the other hand, I feel like I'm not at all knowledgeable because, of course, the Islamic Republic has had a history since its radical phase.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So since the radical phase of the Islamic Revolution, its first 10 years, like the Khomeini years.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, that is still what created the state, right? It's still the essential history of the Islamic Republic. And I should also say, by the way, that the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s was awful, was terrible, and it was also very ambiguous, meaning the US and the Soviet Union supported Iraq against Iran, but the US also kind of supported Iran against Iraq too.
Right.
And so, and that you could easily say, oh, well, the imperialists, they play both sides, it's divide and conquer and whatever. Yeah, but you know what? If you actually care, it's like these kind of glib explanations like imperialism, divide and conquer. No, it has more substance and more significance than that. And it affects things up to today.
Well, what is the explanation then? Why support both sides in a conflict like that?
I think that Brzezinski said, that it was preferable that both sides lose, that neither side win. Right. And
I see. Yeah. Well, that's divide and conquer, isn't it? Keeping them both.
It is, but you still have to think about what results from it. Meaning, there are just too many assumptions packed into that. In other words, the assumption that the US wants to dominate. Okay, let's say that the US wants to dominate. Why? It's the inability to ask why.
Mhm.
And also why countries go along with US domination. And I feel like that's what's not allowed to be asked. It's not even considered, because instead it's like, well, imperialism is bad. Okay, imperialism is bad. It's bad, sure. But this is just a petty bourgeois prejudice. Meaning it's just like my tax dollars shouldn't go into like killing people on the other side of the world, especially when clearly we don't care who wins.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's just a kind of basic bourgeois common sense.
Mm-hmm.
You know, war is bad. And it's really bad if our government, I would never, they, right,
Mm-hmm.
is complicit in wars that have no good purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, that's fine, that's liberalism. We can't leave it there. As socialists, as Marxists, we can't leave it at that place. Like that bourgeois sentimentality, the liberal critique of imperialism is fine, but it really can never explain. And so in the end, it always has to come down to bad actors. It always has to be this or that politician's fault. It has to be Netanyahu, or as my husband Fazal calls him, Satan-Yahu.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be Israel, or as Fazal calls it, Israel, right? I was telling this leftist friend of mine, I live in the Muslim world over here.
Right.
I do. I live completely in the Muslim world. And so, you know, I'm very much aware of this. So it's got to be about like, well, whose fault is it? Who's bad? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just feel like, well, what if they're all the bad guys? And from our perspective, they're all the bad guys.
From the liberal perspective, from liberal bourgeois.
Maybe from that perspective, but certainly from a socialist perspective. I think that the thing with the liberal perspective is that at the end, it will ultimately become a lesser of two evils attitude.
Okay.
Right? And this is what we have to resist.
Right.
I don't know who coined the phrase, the evil of two lessers.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Is that Noam Chomsky? It's something.
It might have been somebody like that.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's not lesser of two evils, it's the evil of two lessers.
If it was Chomsky, it's pretty ironic because he definitely would say vote for the lesser of two evils over and over and over.
Well, also he would be very nationalist in the sense that the lesser evilism, the critique of lesser evilism would stop at the shores of the US. It wouldn't extend internationally because he would, again, just be a liberal anti-imperialist.
Right.
And, you know, and I feel like the main problem with all of that is, yeah, but there are these people in that part of the world. There are these countries, you know, Iran exists. There are people, you know?
Yeah.
And so, you know what I mean? And it's like, there's going to be some future after this.
Are you sure? Because I heard the Gulf War didn't happen.
Oh,
so, yeah. Right. But
well, I mean, from our perspective, I mean, what's interesting is I feel like the time of the media spectacle has passed in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I actually do. I think that now it's much more discursive. It's not images, the way it was for Baudrillard.
Right.
Because what you've seen in the War on Terror is a very restricted selection of imagery that's allowed to be disseminated.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, talk about media bubble, there are like these different worlds. So it's like the people who've seen the Gaza war from the standpoint of like TikTok, and so who have like seen, you know, the gory reality of Israeli military violence in Gaza versus the people who are just watching mainstream media where you don't see that.
Right.
Right. And I think that a lot within the War on Terror also came down to like leaked footage, you know, and, you know, what that showed, you know, and how that scandalized things. And so, you know, I feel like we're in a time where there's a possibility with Trump of it not just being bleeding heart sentimentalism, but it can be a political question. And so the example I was going to use was supposedly, reportedly, Israel was going to assassinate Khamenei, the current Ayatollah, supreme leader of the Islamic Republic. And Trump vetoed it. And so what this comes down to is, should this be a regime change war or not? And then the issue is, okay, does it have to threaten to be a regime change war in order to bring the regime to the negotiating table?
Mm-hmm.
And the history is terrible, right? Meaning, I think people will refer to the fact that Libya gave up its nuclear weapons program, and then they killed him. They killed Gaddafi anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And I just feel like, well, if there hadn't been an uprising in Libya with the Arab Spring,
Mm-hmm.
there probably wouldn't have been the same opportunity for, you know, the Hillary Clinton infamous, we came, we saw, he died.
Right.
Right? If there hadn't been an uprising in Libya, it's not like the US was going to go in there.
Right.
At least not, I mean, maybe at some point, right?
Mm-hmm.
But again, then the question is why? Why? And, you know, I mean, I think that Israel, if you want to know my opinion of what's going on right now,
Mm-hmm.
I think Israel is determined to leverage the October 7th attack to maximum advantage to get rid of all their enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's risky and dangerous, but it may not be as risky and dangerous as people think. In other words, Hamas and Hezbollah folded pretty quickly. Iran might fold pretty quickly too.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, it's remarkable, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the left hates that. But what if it happens? Then what? You know? And so I just, you know, my attitude is I'm not at all sympathetic to the Islamic Republic. At the same time, I'm empathetic in the sense I can see the Islamic Republic, the Iranian regime, as a rational actor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that as soon as they had a nuclear weapon that could be mounted on a missile that they would attack Israel. I don't. Because why?
Right.
Right. And you know what I mean? Like,
Well, because they're Shia extremists who think
right. They're theocratic thugs and whatever. I mean, the point of the matter is that what it is it's a way of preventing retaliation. So it would allow them to do things, and they'd have this deterrent.
The same way it works for every other nation
that has nuclear weapons. Right. It limits other countries' ability to retaliate. Right. And so, you know, and I guess there is this kind of almost logical perspective that everyone has on the left or thinking geopolitically or whatever, the quote unquote left, that like, oh, maybe every country should have nuclear weapons because every country should have the ultimate ability to defend its sovereignty. Okay, you know, I mean, I just remember back in our time.
I think everybody should, you know,
every individual person should have nuclear weapons.
A nuclear weapon, yeah.
Everyone should have the ability to be the ultimate suicide bomber.
That's right.
Right? No.
Oh, okay.
Right? I mean, after all, the Democrats are there to say that we shouldn't even have pistols.
Right. But I go the other way. I think every man has one nuke per person.
No, I think that look, I think that because the rationale there, actually, from a liberal perspective, that every country should have nukes, I think liberals could get on board with that, meaning that everything should be political. You know, that political change should happen only because the people of a country rise up against their own regime.
Right.
Because what I was going to say is, I remember back in our time, the idea that South Africa was developing nuclear weapons in order to preserve the apartheid regime. And it's like, yeah, you know, it doesn't really work that way.
Right.
You know, it's not like having nuclear weapons prevents an internal political upheaval.
No, you can't nuke your own people.
Right. You really just can't.
I mean, maybe you can. I might be wrong. Who knows?
No. I think seriously.
Well, look, Hamas is still governing. I don't know what's possible. But the point is,
well, but it's not like it's. I think in principle, they don't care how many Palestinians die, Hamas. In actual point of fact, of course, the Israeli response is completely beyond anything that they anticipated.
Of course. Yeah, no, I'm not blaming Hamas.
Right.
Exactly.
And but and again, we're in this opaque realm. Israel says it's a 1-to-1 ratio, military to civilian deaths, and that's remarkable for urban warfare, and that the U.S. did much more poorly in Iraq on similar conditions. And that might be true.
Yeah.
Right? That might be true. Okay.
fine. I oppose that.
Well, that's the thing. But that's the thing, right? So again, like, I think that we get into this strange realm of like tactical issues, and then we dress them up as grand ethical problems. It's like a trolley car,
right?
Problem or something. And it's like, you know what? No, it just doesn't lend itself to that. We got to think differently about these things. Right. And and I think that from an actual leftist, a socialist Marxist perspective, we'd have to see the Palestinians as the victims of the nationalists and the Islamists, as well as the Zionists.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, but wait, you don't want people to fight back? And it's like, but there are different ways of fighting back. And also, fight back how? Fight how? Like, with what goals? And so, so again, it's not just like, oh, pacifism versus violence.
Right.
It's not about that. It's about means and ends. But what are the ends? What are the goals here, really? And what are the real possibilities that will result from actions? And I feel like, okay, the Zionists are pursuing their ends, and the Islamists, and before them the nationalists, were pursuing their ends. And none of them are the ends of socialism.
Yeah.
Again, it's a different game.
Yeah.
Different rules, different plays, different game.
There's a way in which we're all pushed to just accept basically the rule by violence. Ultimately, and that we're just pushed to accept that these nationalist projects have to continue indefinitely, and that on some level all that makes sense. And I have a history as like a pacifist, actually. I'm not a pacifist anymore exactly, but I just feel like the aim of the left should be to if you're against war and you're on the left, your aim should be to change the conditions so that wars are no longer necessary. And then that's a big problem. That's a big, you don't do that by saying, okay, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. But and when you pointed out that if every nation had a nuclear bomb, then the regime change would come from within, and that would be good. That's true, right? That's a true
It's true
thing. It's not a good solution. I don't think that's the smart way to go. Every nation.
It's also just not that simple.
Right.
Like, could the American Revolution have won without French intervention?
No.
Maybe not.
Right.
Right? And was it just part of the geopolitical contest between France and Britain? And
no.
Really about, and not really, like, for the French, not really about the American Revolution. In other words, did the French help opportunistically?
Well, yeah.
Right? And did the French hope to dominate the American colonies once they were freed from the British? Of course they did. And, so it comes down to politics, and it comes down to the internal politics of the different countries. It comes down to who in France and who in Britain were actually sympathetic to the American Revolution. Right? And it also comes down to what the purpose of the American Revolution was. Like, why were they declaring independence? What was the goal? What did they want in terms of the world? What did they want in terms of France and Britain? And, so that kind of bourgeois democratic revolution is different from a Islamist revolution. It's different from a nationalist revolution. It is. Even though the Stalinists will identify them falsely, they're not the same. So I think that, so why would the U.S. oppose assassinating the Ayatollah, the supreme leader? Because you might get worse.
Yeah.
Do you want the complete implosion of the Iranian?
If you're Trump, you're like, don't kill this guy. I've been negotiating with him.
Right. Right.
and
Right.
I don't want people I'm going to negotiate with in the future to think that negotiating with me gets them nothing.
Right. Well, it gets them worse than nothing.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't even save their lives.
Right.
Right. Personally, let alone as a leader.
Yeah,
of
the
nation.
regime.
Right.
I mean, so the thing that we should speak to in terms of Iranian history since 1989 is Iran is a capitalist state. So the ACP, the American Communist Party, one of their theorists, Carlos Carrillo, released a video, maybe wrote an article, made an argument that Iran is actually socialist. Okay. Well, it's fine. What's meant by socialism? And also the idea, I think Haas has this idea that despite everything, Russia is still socialist. Meaning the Russian Revolution wasn't defeated. It lives on in Putin's Russia. In some way, of course, this is true. But Iran is only socialist insofar as all capitalism is socialism already.
Right.
Really.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But of course, what it hinges on is nationalism. In other words, for them, it's because the Iranian regime has to take care of its people, it's anti-imperialist, and therefore objectively it's driven to be socialist in some way. But that's just an identification of nationalism and socialism, which I just have to say, nationalism is the most directly and well positioned ideologically and organized means of stopping socialism.
Right.
Right. That it's the old trick of the ruling class, as Lenin put it, nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And what does that mean? Well, because it means it's the nation state and its nationalism that unites the capitalists and the workers.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Okay, so Iran as a capitalist state has developed since 1989. And the articles that I have in The Death of the Millennial Left, the two articles, one was an article that I wrote for the Journal of Zizek Studies, but also published, I think, in the Platypus Review. And the other was my opening remarks at a panel that was held twice, one in Chicago and one at the Left Forum, where I was on with various Iran experts. And so the first, the failure of the Islamic Revolution, and then the other 30 years after the Islamic Revolution, which is the title of the panel. Now, what has happened and why Trump and his people might be wary of getting rid of the Ayatollah and the Guardian Council, right, the actual theocratic regime, is that probably then the only thing that could take over would be the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And they are the largest capitalist interest in Iran. They're the largest property holders. They're the largest single corporate entity in Iran. It's very similar to Egypt and Pakistan, where in those countries the army is the largest single property holder. It's also true of the PLA in China, by the way. The People's Liberation Army in China is also the largest capitalist interest in China. Right, so if you want to know what happens if there's a crisis with the Communist Party in China, who will the world be dealing with? They'll be dealing with the PLA. If there's a collapse of a government in Pakistan, who will the world be dealing with? They'll be dealing with the army. And similarly with Egypt, right? But with Iran, it's not simply the military, it's the IRGC in particular. And so they're a special elite branch, because they're the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. They're not just the Iranian military. So they're not a nation state military. They're more ideological. And they also have a paramilitary dimension. And they participate in both domestic and foreign enforcement of the Islamist government policies. So if you get rid of the Guardian Council and you get rid of the Majlis, the parliament.
Mm-hmm.
This is who you'd have left. And if were that to ever happen, it would be a crisis. Meaning probably the IRGC could not simply rule Iran. And frankly, if they could, they probably would have already couped and taken over in the past.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right, so it's a complicated dance.
So Israel knows this, right?
Of course.
So why did Israel want to go ahead in this direction then? Or maybe they...
Well, that's the thing. It's the ambiguity of threatening regime change even if you don't really want it. But then it might happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the question is, well, but what's the real threat, especially if Hamas and Hezbollah are already pretty much defeated? And also, I think the Shia militias in Iraq have also been largely neutralized. In other words, there might be, from an Israeli perspective, a window of opportunity right now. There might be a particular weakness.
Mm-hmm. But who would Israel imagine would govern in Iran?
Well, they would. Yeah, they know that the IRGC would take over, but they would know that also couldn't last. Right. And so, I mean, look, I know that a lot of my viewers, anyone who knows anything about Iran, will think that this is just foolish and a confession of my ignorance. I would say, don't count out that one fine day in the future, you're going to have the Shah return to Iran.
Mm-hmm.
Because it might be the only, like, as a figurehead, not as a dictator, not like the old Shah. But it could be some constitutional monarchy with the old Pahlavi family is the only, like, form of government that everybody can agree to. So don't count out that possibility. In other words, a constitutional monarchy rather than a republic, right? Because we've had the Islamic Republic.
Mm-hmm.
And, because the Islamic Republic is an Islamic republic, meaning it's a particular kind of republic and it has its liabilities as such. Could it just be a democratic republic? Perhaps. Again, it's going to come down to politics. And I think that, from Israel's or America's perspective, I mean, look, at another level, of course, they don't care what happens in Iran.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning they can always wash their hands of it. They can always say, well, if the Iranians can only, like, collapse into warlordism and chaos, that's on them. They can always, and this is why nationalism is so terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Now the thing with the
from a strictly, again, bourgeois kind of Trumpist perspective, what a waste.
Yes.
All that
exactly.
property.
Why? Right, exactly. In other words, and also, again, this view, like this vision of the future, of like, the world being, a kind of capitalist, cosmopolitan, bourgeois, liberal democracy, all the countries having their own little liberal bourgeois democracy in whatever form, but basically that.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, it's realistic. On the other hand, it's not realistic. Because why haven't we achieved that? And again, we've talked about this before. So if you ask, like, foreign policy people, why isn't the world a Wilsonian, a Woodrow Wilson, League of Nations, democratic, republican, liberal nation states? Why isn't the world just that?
Yeah.
They would say, oh, well, these things happened, the Russian Revolution, communism, fascism, right? And maybe people weren't ready culturally, historically. They didn't have enough of a tradition of democracy or whatever.
Yeah, I hate that one. I always hate that one.
I mean, look, the thing is, we might hate it, but also it's not entirely false. It's not entirely false. It's just glib ideology, though. In other words, it's ex post facto rationalization. It's not that it's totally false,
right?
But it's ideological, and so it's false that way. It's a little bit self-serving, and like I said, it's ex post facto rationalization. And then people will point to things like, oh, well, Mossadegh, they had a democratic leader in the 50s, but the British and Americans overthrew him, right?
Right.
And it's like, well, how democratic was he really? And, was he in this complicated dance with the communists? Meaning, he was trying to use the communists were trying to use him. Would it have been a Cold War liability to lose Iran for the United States and Britain in the Cold War? Yeah, right? In other words, they didn't just overthrow this guy because they can't stand democracy or something, but
Right.
because they were like, he's not really going to be democratic. He's going to be a puppet of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And again, as leftists, I guess we're supposed to think that that's like okay, right?
Mm.
And it's like, or that's better, that's the lesser evil. And you'll get a lot of liberals. Like liberals who are pro-Cuba are like, well,
Mhm.
Cuba's not terrible, It is the lesser of two evils, isn't
Mhm.
it? Right? Cuba is better than other Latin American countries, isn't it? Right? And it's like, okay. I mean, again, it's fine, but it's just not like, it's not a socialist perspective.
Mhm.
And also it has very little to do with what we have to do here. Meaning, when we get too attached to this liberal anti-imperialism,
Mhm.
then we're not only in the realm of the lesser of two evils internationally, we're immediately in the realm of the lesser of two evils domestically. Meaning, we're going to look for the capitalist politicians who are going to offer the policy that's amenable to the
Mhm.
other countries' lesser of two evils.
Mhm.
And that's always a complicated thing too. Meaning, the doves, like, I don't know, Bernie Sanders is pro-Cuba, right?
Mhm.
Does that mean that he wants the US to become more like Cuba? No, he would say that he does not.
Mhm.
So ultimately, isn't it just a more cunning way of undermining Cuba? Meaning, it's a tactical option.
Mhm.
Meaning, you could be confrontational, antagonistic, or you could be friendly and undermine them
Right.
that way.
Right.
But ultimately, I think that, Bernie Sanders is against like belligerence, and he's against like abusing the Cuban people, and that's all well and good. But ultimately, he thinks that Cuba should be liberalized, that it shouldn't be the Stalinist regime.
Mhm.
And that he thinks that his way, being friendly, is the best way to achieve that.
Right.
Right? As opposed to other people who are like, well, it's a totalitarian regime where they squash all dissent, and so it's not liberalizing. And so we have to keep up maximum pressure.
Mhm.
Right? And they're both right.
Mhm.
They're both right. But again, neither is our perspective. Meaning, our perspective is socialism in the United States will take care of Cuba. It
Mhm.
won't have to be a Stalinist dictatorship, nor will it have to be a liberal, democratic, so-called, but really capitalist fiasco, third world country.
Right.
And so, but again, I feel like people are like, they want today to know which side they want to be on, which side they should be on, who they should be rooting for, what they want to have happen.
Mhm.
I mean, so I will just, for reasons of transparency, I will express my own perspective on these things.
Mhm.
Do I want Israel to be successful in its military campaign against Iran? No.
Mhm.
Do I want Iran to be successful in its ability to exact a very high price on Israel for attacking it? No.
Mhm.
I really am on neither side, and I don't want either to suffer too much or achieve too much.
Right.
In other words, I think that this war is unfortunate.
Right. But it's happening. So if you had arms, you would send arms to both sides.
I don't know what you do. I mean, no, it's right. It's happening. It's kind of like, I remember Elon Musk was going to cut off Ukraine from Starlink,
Mhm.
right? Meaning, could you? It's not about sending arms to both sides. It's about, okay, could you refuse to help
Right.
Israel in certain ways?
Actually, it's like disarm both sides. You could
Yeah,
do that.
could you do that?
Because in fact, they're arming both sides now.
They're only arming the Israeli side, and they're disarming the Iranian side, because I think that the ballistic missile goal, the idea is to that Iran's going to use up all its ballistic missiles now, and it will kill some few hundred Israelis, but ultimately, more importantly, it will be depleted, right?
Right.
And so, I mean, look, Iran is the weaker side.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's a good bourgeois sentiment to root for the underdog and to root for the victim.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I mean, it's a complicated thing. I think that Iran wants nuclear weapons for geopolitical reasons. I think the Shah wanted nuclear weapons, and so the Islamic Republic wants nuclear weapons for the same reason that the Shah wanted nuclear weapons. Iran wants nuclear weapons, Islamist regime or not. Right? It's bordered by nuclear powers. It's bordered by Russia and Pakistan. India is there, China is there, Russia, obviously, and Israel is there. And so Iran wants nuclear weapons, and the US is against nuclear proliferation. It is against nuclear proliferation. I mean, I've said this in the past, but I'll say it now for brevity's sake. I'm sure the US would love it for Britain and France to give up their nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Right? So, and I think that in this respect, like the Trump line, like Iran simply can't have nuclear weapons, period. And then it gets into this more ambiguous domain of like nuclear enrichment technology, and can't they just get enriched uranium from other countries rather than enriching it themselves, right? And it's all part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I mean, one of the background events was the IAEA, the UN watchdog group, announced that Iran was no longer compliant. So I think that Trump's going to make it part of his negotiating strategy, but I think that he really did not want Israel to attack.
Yeah, I agree.
But he needs to now try to use it, right?
Yeah.
But now he needs to try to use it. And are there people in his administration who welcome the Israeli attack? Yes, I'm sure there are. But I think that himself didn't, and I think there are other people in the administration who also did not. Right? But again, the US and Israel are allies. And so, as such, they're going to paper over any differences, even though it's obvious. It's obvious, right? And that this isn't some like total mindfuck. I mean, the problem with the doublethink thing is that the doublethink thing, I think that Orwell was interested in how it spontaneously happened. And that it wasn't about some far-flung future, it was about his own time.
Right. No, I know that.
Right. And, just for our listeners. And so I think that doublethink had happened already, and it had been well established. Meaning, remember the Maine, Spanish-American War, the birth of U.S. imperialism. Did the Spanish blow up the U.S. ship in Havana Harbor, or did it blow up on its own? Or did it blow up on its own, but it wouldn't have been there if the Spanish government hadn't been doing a horrible counterinsurgency demanding that the U.S. send a show of force because of its capitalist interests in Cuba? Meaning, what business did the U.S. have sitting a battleship in a hot, sweltering Havana Harbor? Well, that's the fault of the Spanish anyway. So they blew it up even if they didn't blow it up. It's like that. In the same way that, who killed the civilians in the October 7th attack? Was it Hamas? Was it Islamic Jihad? Was it some random Gazan people? Or was it the Israeli military itself? And even if it was some random Gazan people, or even if it was Islamic Jihad or Hamas, it's still Israel's fault. Sure, of course, sure. But, right? Hamas still started the war.
Right.
And again, we can't get hung up on the tactical, ethical. Was it a good idea? Was it a bad idea? I knew it was a bad idea.
Yeah.
I knew it was a bad idea. I knew it would be a disaster for the Palestinians. And I knew that the best that could come out of it would be some kind of negotiation.
Right.
And that was actually Hamas's goal. That is their goal in this instance with this attack, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was to force the Israelis to the negotiating table and to try to make the conditions under which it would be most advantageous for the Palestinian side.
Mm-hmm.
It failed.
Mm-hmm.
It failed. And how could it not fail? And so, look, I mean, Iran, I mean, Trump's attitude is Iran would have gotten a better deal before Israel attacked, but they dragged it out until Israel attacked. And so they only have themselves to blame.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the charming naivete of Trump. Meaning, yes, of course, the sanctions on Iran and blah, 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 and longstanding like perfidy of Israel and the alliance of the U.S. with Israel and all this. Yes. There's a historical context, of course there is. But the future is unwritten.
Mm-hmm.
And what Trump represented was potentially turning the page.
Right. But this gets me to I think my real question for you, Chris, is that when you have this apparatus that's going on that perpetuates itself from one administration to another, it seems like the possibility for really turning the page, even on small things, and I think actually a negotiated deal with Iran, more security in the Middle East, a small thing.
Yeah.
I'm going to say, even on that level, or on the level of no longer having, in the United States, no longer having such a draconian and intrusive surveillance apparatus. Roll that back a little bit. Small thing. Seems like Trump's really struggling to turn the page on much.
Well, it's the inability to do so. Meaning, again, we have to understand why these things exist. And they don't exist because of bad actors.
Right.
They exist out of an apparently objective necessity.
Yeah. I think the best thing you said once, the best thing about Trump is what he'll expose.
Yes. It exposes things, right? It exposes things. And I think that, again, since we have no power, none.
Right.
And again, I'm just aware of the fact that people are so screwed up in their own heads that they're engaged in magical thinking, and they do like have a superstitious thought that like what they think will have effects in the world. Right? You're like, no, I mean, people really are. I mean, we are
That's a terrible thing for people to think.
It is.
Because it means that you are afraid of thinking.
It's an unconscious. It's a deeply set unconscious thing. Actually, tonight I'm teaching Adorno's Freudian theory and the pattern of fascist propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very hard, my social worker students, it's very hard for them to understand what he means, right? When he says, look, it's not the fascist propaganda that's the problem, it's the psychology of the people. That's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, why do people want to believe this stuff? And again, for us, what's important is the authoritarianism on the left. Meaning, why do people believe this stuff? What's this will to believe on the left about? Because it's a real problem. The will to believe on the right is an obvious problem.
Right, yeah.
But the will to believe on the left is a serious problem from our perspective, as leftists, as socialists, as Marxists. Meaning that's the obstacle we're dealing with. And it simply is not the case. Of course, liberals would say all the authoritarians are on the right. And the leftists are the non-authoritarian people. And it's like, that's really just, it's only true at the most superficial level. At a more basic level, under duress, that difference evaporates entirely. And I think we've seen that in our time.
For sure.
And that's the other thing that I'm sort of very much aware of. We're dealing with very primitive, very crude ways of thinking and ideas that people have. The idea that the right is about like selfishness and a negative view of human nature, like a dark view of human nature, whereas the left is like has a more cheery, optimistic, like the right believes that humans are inherently bad and the left believes humans are inherently good. We're dealing with that still, Doug. And that just won't do. Because again, that just leads you into this bizarre liberal conundrum. You know?
Well, if that's, let's say that's true, why are there people who believe that humans are inherently bad? They
Well,
must be inherently bad.
Isn't there?
Huh?
There's evidence for both.
No, I know there's evidence,
right?
but I'm just saying the right thing to do is to believe, the good thing to do is to believe that everyone's inherently good. And if everyone was inherently good, then everyone would believe that everyone is inherently good. You know, I mean, just like a,
yeah, that's right. That's the liberal rationale, right? Is like,
right.
Again, it's a will to believe at a certain level. And that's where, you know, I think this is difficult for people. I think that freedom is beyond good and evil.
Right.
You know, it's the Rousseauian idea that freedom is for good or for ill.
Right.
And, you know, it's the source of everything good. It's the source of everything evil too. You know, meaning, of course, nature is a source for evil and it's a source for good. You know, meaning we are a social animal, and so all of our good impulses come from nature. And we're also animals, which means all of our bad impulses, our evil impulses, come from nature too. But we're not dealing with that. We're dealing with society. And society is beyond good and evil because it's a transformation of that natural potential for both good and evil. And I think that that's the other thing that people like look at a visceral level. And what's interesting to me is, again, Trump. Didn't want war, but is going to try to use it to his advantage.
Right.
And I think that people think that it's either principled or it's not principled. It's either idealistic or it's cynical. It's right. And he's either well-intentioned or is a sociopath. And it's like, you know, all and none of the above.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? He's a politician. He's in office. He's a person. It's the man and the position. And it's this moment. Right? And it's just not resolvable in any of those things, meaning it's not resolvable at a level of personal psychology. It's not resolvable in terms of the position of US president. It's not resolvable in any of those ways. It's a mixture of these things. And it ultimately comes down to decisions. And the main condition that we have to pay attention to, the most important condition that we should try to learn something about, is political.
Right.
And I think that that's where the crisis of the party system in the United States, the deep state run amok, the foreign policy establishment, having a lock on things even while they're completely helpless in the face of world events. I think these are the things that Trump is a symptom of and also illuminating about. Meaning we're seeing the limits of civilian government. You know, and if we are going to be motivated ultimately by a basic liberal reaction to things, then we do need to start and end with, don't we want civilian government?
Yeah. I want to point, you know, we just finished this documentary, The Last Election. We're kind of going over it, and we're going to tweak it a little bit after the screening. And Ed wrote me some notes. And one of the things that came up in the conversation back and forth, and I don't remember exactly how, but was a mention of Ross Perot. I remember he said, "Oh, Doug, you were so confused by politics in 1992 that you ran a toy goldfish for president." And I kind of stepped back and go, "I'm confused. I was revolutionary,
right?
But wait. But I thought about it, and I thought, you know what? What was it? What was it that made me so discouraged and disgusted with those two choices?" And it was pretty simple and issue oriented. It was the Gulf War. It was neither of them were clearly staking out a claim to have opposed the Gulf War and to be willing to move away from those kinds of interventions, which I thought was unnecessary. They could have been handled without so much bloodshed. It was almost a setup, you know.
I think that you talked about this with Ben Studebaker this week on Sublation show.
I did a bit, but I want to get to the end of the thought.
Okay.
The point is this. With Ross Perot, though,
Mm-hmm.
I could have voted for him.
Yeah.
And I didn't even consider it.
Uh,
You know, but Ross Perot actually had said very consistently that he was against the Gulf War.
right.
But somehow because of, I don't know why at the time, I'm trying to remember, but it was the combination of him not being left, not
Mm-hmm.
like left.
Oh yeah,
totally.
yeah. No, he's like a billionaire businessman. Yeah.
Right. And also the nationalist reasoning behind his being opposed to the Gulf War. You know, why are we wasting our money?
It was a conservative, liberal, anti-imperialism.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
Which is what Trump is.
Right. Absolutely. So those were the reasons why, but I just ultimately didn't believe him. Like it was like, he's a bad actor. He's bad was what the reason why I didn't vote for him, because of his motivations, I thought, maybe.
No, sure. I mean, it's not about not trusting the motivations. You just didn't trust what he represented, and that's fine. That's justified.
Yeah. Okay. But if I had been strictly like
instrumental about it.
Yeah.
Like, in other words, if you really were voting on that war as an issue, then you should have voted for him.
Yeah. Right.
No, the Democrats still had you.
Yeah. Even though I didn't vote for Clinton.
They still had you. Meaning we definitely have to free ourselves from the idea that we're being disappointed. That Trump's disappointing us. You know?
Right.
We're not being disappointed. I want to see him try as much as possible. I'm disappointed insofar as he doesn't try. But that includes trying things that I don't agree with.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because, I mean, then there are the things that I'm completely unsympathetic to, like obviously the deportation and all that stuff. That I have no sympathy to whatsoever. But here, okay, so being against the Gulf War and having that be your principle, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way you put it in the film in the last election is that you were shocked that there was a war so soon after the end of the Cold War.
Right.
Okay, so all these years later, can we talk about, like 35 years later?
Right.
Can we talk about how, of course, the end of the Cold War was not going to be the end of war, because actually the end of the Cold War left a lot of unfinished business. Like the end of the Cold War per se meant that there would be certain wars.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the two wars that come to mind for me, the Gulf War, the Yugoslav Civil War, the Yugoslav Civil War, meaning Stalinism was not going to collapse without there being some wars. And Saddam was a Soviet client. I remember my Spartacus League comrades. They thought it was a crime that the Soviet Union withdrew its forces from Iraq on the eve of the Gulf War. Right? Because they wanted the Soviet Union to defend Iraq against the United States. And they
wait. The Soviet Union had already, the Gulf War happened right almost immediately at the same time the Soviet Union had cracked up.
Right. But not quite. In other words, there still were military advisors. There were still weapon systems that could only be manned by those troops. Right.
But they were negotiating with the United States on how they were going to, you know, and getting support from the United States.
But anyway, the Spartacists were like, think U.S. imperialism in the Persian Gulf. Right. And I mean, look, I was sympathetic to that line. I was like, yes, it is a crime. It shows the perfidy of Stalinism that they're leaving Iraq defenseless. But then at the end of the day, come on, Saddam Hussein, Baathism, Iraq, the invasion of Kuwait, come on. And so I think the way you talked about it with Ben this week was you focused on two things. And again, this is your conservative, liberal, anti-imperialism, which is fine. But basically, April Gillespie, did she give a clear indication? Right? No, it seemed to be an unclear message, and so it was like a setup. because like the U.S. seemed to indicate that it didn't care.
Mm-hmm.
And then it seemed like Saddam was willing to surrender, but then the U.S. like massacred the fleeing troops.
Mm-hmm. This is actually we were actually talking about the more current Iraq war, and we're talking about, I think, whether
Also
or not
that.
they could have deported. Yeah. Anyway.
Right. Also that. But the Gulf War context, I think you and Ben were talking about this, and I heard in that the seeming duplicity and perfidy of the U.S. in the Gulf
War.
Yeah. Okay. But Doug, really, Iraq showed itself by invading Kuwait.
Right.
The army had to be destroyed. That was it. In other words, once it did it, then of course the U.S. had to destroy the retreating army because the army had to be destroyed. Meaning Saddam had to be robbed of the ability to do that. Period. He showed that he would do it, and therefore, and not his regime overthrown, but his army destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And there were people who were calling for regime change.
And that includes the soldiers too, right? You're saying that even if they left their tanks and their weapons behind and retreated?
Well, the soldiers are the military.
Right.
The soldiers are the military. That's what we're talking about. The ability to make war. It's the people.
Mm-hmm.
And why? Well, Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
There was a coalition. And it was the Gulf states. It was Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
And so the thing is, there are no clear, easy answers at the level of principle, ethics, tactical decisions. There aren't. In other words, they made choices given circumstances. They made judgment calls. I'm sure they made mistakes. But the reason, right, rather than, they had to destroy the Ba'athist regime because it was too strong against Israel or whatever, some nonsense, or too strong against the Saudi monarchy, and so they had to bait them into invading Kuwait, and then they had to destroy them. And it's like, there isn't some kind of grand plan. Meaning Saddam made a mistake, and it cost him and his country dearly.
Yeah, but I still think that if you're a mob boss, and another mob boss says, "I want to take over this territory," it's not your territory, but this other mob boss, I want to take over their territory. And you go, whatever you want to do, it's your business. And then they do it, and you say, you know what, I changed my mind, and you have to be completely.
That's right. In other words, mob bosses do change their mind. In other words, in the abstract, it sounds okay, but then in reality, it's like, actually, no. And like I said, it's because Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. And, and it's also, by the way, about Iran.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Meaning Iraq came out on top in the Iran-Iraq war. They didn't succeed against Iran, but they also they weren't defeated either.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, they came out a battle-hardened army, Iraq. So that army was dangerous. And if you have a regime that shows it's willing to use it, then it's doubly dangerous. If they never did invade Kuwait, there would not have been a Gulf War. There are decisions that are made. Come on. In other words, just basic logic, rather than paranoid something or other, right? Rather than confusing cause and effect, and of course, the U.S. imperialism is responsible for everything bad in the world. Okay. No, not really. Not when you get into the details. Right. There are decisions made. There is agency.
I would have, how I would have responded to this conversation when I was 21 years old?
I would have been very angry.
I would have gotten very angry. Yeah. I would not have accepted this at all.
Well, I tried to recruit someone to the Spartacus Youth Club at Hampshire College, and he balked at the Spartacus position. He just said, you know what? Ultimately, I don't agree with the enemy of my enemy as my friend. That's not a good way of being a socialist politically. And it's true. It's not a good way.
No.
And so, and, neither is it good for us to make excuses for, look, Saddam Hussein, come on, Saddam Hussein. It's not to demonize Saddam Hussein, but what are we talking about? Come on.
Right.
They tortured soccer players for not winning games.
Just to be kind of left-centric and American-centric maybe for a second, if I think back on who I was when I was 21 and why it was so important to me to like think I absolutely knew what was the right thing about the Gulf War and knew down to my bones that it was
Right.
absolutely an evil thing. It was like I was struggling to hold on to a job washing dishes. You know, like I dropped out of college and was living with my girlfriend in Portland, and you know, to have something that I really knew.
I mean,
and
look,
believed.
the system, right? Like we just had the King's Day protests, we had the anti-ICE protests, we had very passionate young people telling the police on the street and the National Guards people on the street that they're fascists.
Mm-hmm.
And we had Maxine Waters
Mm-hmm.
on the street trying to shame the National Guard troops, California National Guard. Like, are you going to shoot me?
Mm-hmm.
You know, there might be a place for that if it was like socialists confronting the police or something, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not, and so there isn't.
Right.
Right? Meaning these rad lib kids, yes, they've convinced themselves that all cops are bastards, they're all fascists, we're living under fascism. They probably would think that even if it was Kamala instead of Trump.
Mm-hmm. Definitely would.
Right? But no.
Right.
You know, it's not to let the cops off or something. Because, you know, I watched the crackdown on the protests, the arrest of the protesters. Brutal.
Right.
Horrible. Brutal. Horrible. Inexcusable.
Mm-hmm.
Horrible. Brutal. So, do I think the police should be on the street? Do I think they should be cracking heads? And did Trump want to crack heads? Definitely. Like he wanted to send a message.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He wanted to say protests won't be tolerated. That's
and that happens over and over again. That happens with every regime.
And then Karen Bass eventually had the police go in, right? The mayor of LA eventually ordered the police to charge on their horses.
Right.
You know? I mean, so, but again, why? Not because these people are fascists. It doesn't even matter if they are fascists, but objectively.
Right.
You know, what's going on? What is this about? And ultimately, the
mm-hmm.
politics, like meaning these forces exist, they're going to be utilized. The politics, what is Trump trying to do? Comprehensive immigration reform. He's trying to do the same thing that Bush and Obama were trying to do, and that Biden didn't even bother trying to do.
Right.
I don't know why. I guess because the Senate was controlled by the Republicans. Although, didn't they have a one vote, like a tiebreaker vote, Kamala?
Yeah.
Right? So why didn't Biden try to do comprehensive immigration reform? He didn't even try. We can say George W. Bush, Obama, and Trump all tried. Biden didn't even try. But that is the end game, which, by the way, that's the bipartisan consensus end game, which, by the way, I disagree with. We've talked about this. I disagree with it because it's a three-tiered labor force. It's guest workers, it's citizens, it's illegals. Instead of two.
The thing about bringing up, you know, who I was when I had that position and when I formed it and how long it. I mean, I've just held on to that belief that forever, and I still, you know, you gave me a pretty convincing argument, and I'll rethink it some, but I still fundamentally kind of feel like, oh, that was avoidable, but maybe
the Gulf War.
Yeah, the Gulf War.
It was definitely avoidable.
Yeah. But the thing about the reason I raised who I was and like how I was actually a food server, not washing dishes. But the point is, I was in no position to really be making calls about those things, and I should have been. If there had been a left that was a peace movement, say, that was worthwhile, it would have been about like helping people like me who cared learn about what actually was going on.
That's the thing. No, they were trying to have some kind of urgent effect, and a pressure tactic in capitalist politics. And also, obviously, a lot of the groups that organize such things are only self-interested in terms of keeping their own organizations going.
Right.
Right. That's a problem. You know.
So, like, if there was no one there who would say to me, "Hey, I want you to listen to the other side. Not that your instincts are wrong, but just think about the whole picture."
There were pro-war counter-demonstrators. So I was a demonstrator against the Gulf War, and we were attacked physically by pro-war counter-demonstrators. They charged our line with a American flag used as a weapon, injured people grievously, and they had crazy signs that said "Sodom insane" and showed like Sodom in like butt fucking a helpless child.
Right.
It was ugly.
No, it was.
And so I'm not sure that the counter demonstrators were there to make a reasonable argument.
No,
they were certainly not.
No, the left. I'm saying leftists should have done that. Like the peace organizers themselves should have stepped back and tried to understand the full situation.
I mean, look, we were in 1991. We were down a certain highway of cynicism on the left that had taken hold in the 80s.
Right.
And I think they smelled blood in the water. Reaganism was getting old. There was some desperation to it. I don't know if you remember the other war, Somalia.
I do.
Right? The thing that, is one of the things that George Herbert Walker Bush left as a legacy for Bill Clinton. Right? The real question is what the goal. I mean, again, protest demos, protest movements don't have the goal of educating people, and educating the public and educating broadly, educating more deeply individuals. The left groups are not particularly good at that either, and it's controversial and whatever cantankerous as the Spartacists might have been. I'm sure I get a better education than other left groups provided young people.
Right. But
even in my case, the education was hampered by the line taking, the position taking, that it wasn't enough to be against the war. You had to be for the active military defeat of the United States, and therefore you had to be for the active military victory of Saddam Hussein, even though that can't happen.
Right.
Not happen, right? So like just this whole idea, like in other words, like I don't know, you're rooting for Hamas, but it can't happen. Children, stop. Right? And like people are like, well, Iran is not Iraq. Iran is not Afghanistan. Iran is not Hezbollah. Iran is not Hamas. Actually, Iran might be something that could be totally destroyed by Israel. It could be David and Goliath. Like in other words, like, but this hope, we want the people who are the enemies of our enemy to win. But what if it's not going to happen? What if it can't happen? Then what?
Right. And what if it did happen? What would, I mean?
Well, really? Sure. What if it did happen?
Right?
I don't know, if Iran occupied Israel and subjected the Jews to dimitude. I don't know. Maybe that's not the worst case scenario.
No, but the real...
In other words, that may not be worse than a civil war in Iran.
The real fantasy is that the United States collapses.
Oh, well, there's that fantasy. But that's down the road, Doug. Like, first you get rid of the Zionist entity, then the dominoes fall, and eventually the US, right?
Yeah, right.
And, and it's absurd. And I guess, like, the geopolitical mind, it's like, oh, well, Iran can't fall because then
imagine
Russia will fall.
Their own bodies thrown on heaps as a victim.
Well, I mean, we're encouraged to. I mean, look, I'm subject to this. In other words, like, I'm thinking about this as a physical thing, as like horrible, like, it's just a horror that we're facing here.
Right.
And, I just think the Islamic Republic, the Islamic Revolution, was never going to have a good outcome in the end.
Right.
That's it. And again, what I studied the history, like the Iran-Iraq War. Iran suffered a great deal more than Iraq did in that war. They sent children unarmed to try to just be human shields against Iraqi tanks. It was awful. They convinced them that they were going to paradise if they got ran over by an Iraqi tank. It's awful. This is just terrible. But again, well, what were they supposed to do? Right? But then you have to fault the Iraqis as well as faulting the Islamic regime. The Islamic Revolution was not a good idea. Just was not a good idea. You know, what Netanyahu called theocratic thuggery, it's not been a good idea. Okay, it's kept itself going for 40 years, for 45 years. That doesn't change the fact that it's not a good idea, and also that its time is running out. Meaning once that generation is gone, that's the end. And, you know, I think that in one of my articles, I think it was To the Shores of Tripoli, in The Death of the Millennial Left, you know, I talked about the collapse of Gaddafi in Libya. And you know, and again, I'm trying to provoke the left into thinking. I said, maybe Jean Kirkpatrick was right. Maybe like tin pot dictatorship, autocratic, authoritarian, traditional dictatorship regimes are better than totalitarian regimes. Because you can kind of liberalize and transition to democracy from a traditional authoritarian regime more easily than you can transition from totalitarian regime. You know, it's a whatever theory. It's kind of a garbage theory. But Gaddafi was a socialist. That might have made his regime worse, not better, especially in terms of its eventual outcome. Meaning, we just, like, especially Libya, like, we're not talking about Cuba. Again, I raised Cuba. That regime was not going to survive Gaddafi. The Islamic Republic is not going to really survive the generation that made the revolution.
Right.
It's not a good idea.
And we've been talking for longer than I thought for the first part, and I just want to say one thing and give you a chance to respond, which is to say this. A lot of times what people will do, Chris, is you'll say these things that you think, right? Like Iran won't survive the current regime, or China will eventually fall, or whatever it might be, right?
Yeah.
And people will think to themselves, okay, well, if Chris is wrong, then I can walk away from anything he has to say, or you're making predictions.
Yeah, they don't. Okay, so let's make.
Well, I just want to. I want to say the point of this conversation for me is not whether or not you are right or wrong about all of your predictions, political predictions, or even your analysis of the history. I'm sure you've got most of the history right. The point is that so much of the time, most of the time, we take political positions, develop political lines, without thinking anywhere near the level that we've been talking on.
Right, that's true.
Right, and the point is, why? What is? We're actually in a position where we want to.
Oh yeah, why don't people allow themselves? Because it's depressing. It fills you with a sense of hopelessness. You know, whatever. You know. And I mean, but again, the hope that people have is entirely misplaced.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the thing. I mean, in other words, like, you know, the 1,000-year Reich was not going to last. It just never was going to last.
Right.
And the Islamic Revolution is not going to last. It just never was.
Right.
And, you know, I mean, even the Soviet Union and Communist China, they have a lifespan. The lifespan is they might be able to get one more generation out after the original generation. But it usually involves some major purge. So there was a post-Mao major purge in China that gave it another generation lease on life. There were the Stalinist purges that gave it another lease on life. Iran has not quite had that. It's threatened to have that, but it hasn't quite had that. And so, you know, but in the end, where is it all going to lead? Right? It's not leading to some civilizational, geopolitical, like, dystopia, utopia, Eurasianism. It's just not, right? There are people in Iran who just want to be bourgeois, like working class, commercial society people. That's the majority of people. And so it's just, you know, it's like if there were a theocratic dictatorship established in the United States, it's not going to end well. It's not going to last. It's not going to end well. It's not going to last. And so it's better for us to muddle along with this whatever shit we have than to have some crazy revolution that leads to some insane conservative reactionary nonsense. because at the end of the day, it is unnecessary suffering. And there was so many dimensions of that to the Islamic Revolution. There's, like I said, the Iran-Iraq War, horrible. There was the purge of the left, which came out of the left's own support for the Islamic Revolution, horrible.
Mm-hmm.
A total liquidation of like generations of intellectuals and activists, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people, who were, of course, better, than who remained. And, so it's, so of course, I've been waking up every morning. What have I been expecting to have happen? That Trump has pulled a rabbit out of his hat and negotiated an end to the Israel-Iran war.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm hoping every day. And, and I think that as unlikely as it might be, it's the best possible outcome.
Oh, well, yeah. Who would disagree with that, though, Chris? I mean, really?
I don't know, but I think that people don't even consider the possibility of it. Again, and just to get to the point, which we've talked about before, Socratic.
Right.
Devil's advocate. Why am I saying what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
I am trying to get people to think.
Right.
It is the Socratic method. It is the devil's advocate. It is the gadfly on the left. It is.
Mm-hmm.
And, meaning, can you think about these things? Can you be curious also? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you reaching for explanations that stop thinking?
Right.
That absolve you of having to think? And also, are you emotionally, psychologically attached to the passion of it to the point where you're using your passion to also stop yourself from thinking?
Right.
Because there will be a world on the other side of whatever atrocity. I thought about writing an article on this, on the Iran-Israel war, and I thought I already wrote that article. It's called the Ukraine war article.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Ukraine, more of the same. I mean, there is a lot more for me to say in this instance because of my background, and because it's more complicated. It is actually more complicated, potentially.
Mm-hmm.
Or it might not be. It might just be two states slugging it out.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to pay attention to that too, which is that we might get inappropriately attached to things, relate to things at the wrong level, and lose the forest for the trees.
Mm-hmm.
That happens a lot, and it is part of the paranoid, fixation on details, the facts, like, wait, but what about this? What about that? And it's like, but none of that is ultimately consequential, and so I think that it's difficult, but I think that a circumspect attitude,
Mm-hmm.
What is it? The Socratic you quoted in the film.
Oh, right.
Beginning of knowledge is knowing that you know nothing.
Right.
But you actually have to know something to know that you know nothing.
You have to know that much anyway. That was the...
Well, but you actually need to be knowledgeable enough to know what you don't know.
Right.
And so, in terms of my education on the Iranian history, I know enough to know what I don't know.
Right.
Right. And so, meaning, like I said, I know a lot about 1979 to 1989. I know less about 1989 to 2025, although I know something because the Green Movement, I paid some attention, and then I've paid some attention, and I've had Iranian students over the years, and they've informed me about things. And so, I've kept up, but the basic framework, of what the Islamic Republic is and what it isn't, and what its viability is and its lack thereof is. I know enough to know what I don't actually know, but I know enough.
We're going to talk about unknown knowns in the Patreon section. I'm going to go, as always, get some more coffee. And thank you, Chris. Thank you. I want to, my younger self wants to begrudgingly thank you about the Gulf War conversation. Despite the fact that, you haven't won me over entirely, you certainly have made me rethink. Obviously, everything you said about it was true. It's true though, it was completely avoidable, and I was right to feel as though I had been betrayed
Yes.
when there were still wars like
Yes.
this going on after the
Yes.
collapse of. It meant something about the Cold War, though. It didn't.
Yes.
No.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to end the recording there. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.